Welcome to another edition of Project Cancer. Today we have James Hawkins, who I've known for about 8 years. I actually interviewed him for a role on a train, in fact, on the way from Cambridge to London, joined a company that I was on the board of, which we successfully exited. I'm an angel investor, as I said on previous episodes. And James was our star sales guy. He left the company and formed another company, but he's not here to discuss his entrepreneurial journey, but the somewhat tragic but so far successful journey of his daughter. So James, could you introduce yourself and your family and your daughter?
Yeah, so I'm James. I live kind of just outside Cambridge with my wife, and I've got a 2.5-year-old called Ruby. She got diagnosed with cancer in October, kind of a year and a half ago. She's got bilateral retinoblastoma. So we've kind of been through chemo, like had an eye removed and all sorts of like fairly horrendous treatment. But now we're kind of out the other side of it, basically.
But at the same time, you've been building a business. Your wife's got a role as well. So let's talk through the Ruby primarily, and you drop in and out of the stresses and strains in the family life for that.
Yep.
So when did you first notice, or how did you notice there was a problem?
Sure. So with it happened much faster than I would have expected. So I think one day we kind of realised that one of her eyes looked very slightly different colour to the other. So she had kind of blue eyes, and then one of her eyes started looking kind of a bit greener, basically, which didn't really concern us. And that kind of, I think we booked, my wife had an optician's appointment booked for like a few days, like a week out or 2 weeks away from that time. And then within like another couple of, and we're like, okay, well, we'll just take her to the opticians with us, whatever, just see what they say. And then a couple of days later, suddenly one of her pupils started dilating a lot, like much more so than the other one. The change then was really quick. Like we were kind of like, okay, this is obviously very serious. We need to speak to someone. This was kind of the day that my wife went to the optician anyway. He went to the optician, and the optician was like, oh, this doesn't look good.
And she was about 18 months old, Ruby, was she?
Yeah, so she would have been just 17 months old or something like that. So the optician kind of said, oh, I'll talk to the hospital and get you booked in. We had an appointment for something like a month out or whenever it was supposed to be. So I just called up, I paid to see I went privately just to pay to see a GP kind of thing. Like I had some health insurance for it, but it wouldn't have been that expensive, just did one appointment. Yeah. And then the GP on the phone was like, no, you need to immediately go to A&E and get this looked at. The thing with retinoblastoma is that it is it's very primarily a childhood cancer. It's something through the genes that, in most cases, it's something through the genes that make your eye grow in the first place, kind of not stopping, basically. Most children who get it diagnosed a lot earlier, so it will have been probably happening since she was born very slowly. But the typical way that someone spots it is that they, if you take a flash photo of their eyes, the tumour in your eye reflects back white, so you'll get kind of one dark eye and one white eye. Okay. The problem is today no one uses flash photography anymore.
The cameras are too good, aren't they?
So too good. We went back through, it was kind of like a bit morbid, but we went back through all of the photos and stuff we've taken of it, being like, have we missed this? Like really obviously. And we literally couldn't see it in any of them. So we're just probably just reassure ourselves that we didn't miss something. But yeah, we had very little warning. And then just suddenly, and then it was just a blur of kind of hospital appointment. Like it was hospital every day.
Statistically, how common is this type of cancer?
I think about 40 children a year in the UK get it.
And there's about 1 million born, so that's 40 out of approximately 1 million.
Yeah, the frustrating thing kind of is that the numbers are so low, but the tests, if you've got it, is very basic. Like at home, all you take a flash photo of their eye, or shine a light in their eye and take a photo of them. So it's like a 5-second kind of check, but we're just totally unaware of it in the first place. I'm sure there's many other things I'm still unaware of that we should be checking as well. But the test is frustrating.
So let's talk through Ruby's journey from 18 months to, she's 2.5 now, is she?
So next up, once we got diagnosed pretty quickly. So we kind of had like appointment in Allen Brooks in Cambridge. They kind of said, okay, you need to go see a specialist for this. So within a day or two, we were in London and kind of hopping between like Royal Hospital and what's it called? The one that does all the charity work. Ormond Street. Yeah. So we're kind of hopping between the two.
Yeah.
This was probably the low point, I think, for us, because we got diagnosed. Each eye gets a grade from 1 to 5 over how severe it is, where 1 is the most minor and 5 is the most serious. Where 5 is kind of like, this is a very high risk of spreading. And we thought, okay, well, we've got one eye that looks pretty bad. Wouldn't surprise us this is like 4 or 5, and then our other eye seems fine. But it turned out that she had one eye was 5, and then the other eye was 4. And so it's like there's a very high chance of losing both her eyes. The like upside of what we got told was the upside of this cancer is it doesn't spread. It's extremely rare that it spreads. Like I don't think it's metastasized in a patient in the UK for years, kind of thing. It does happen in other countries where people just can't get it looked at. So the verdict was immediately, okay, the eye that's grade 5 needs to be enucleated, which just means removed, which is actually quite a weirdly minor surgery, as in like you just walk out the same day. And then the other eye, then the battle was like, okay, we need to try and save her other eye so she has vision.
And the 4 was creeping towards 5, was it? So is that?
He was kind of, I think again, it's a bit of a like grey line, which one they give you anyway. The problem, but then the part that was particularly stressful was she had like just kind of randomly about 6 months before had this lump that had appeared in her armpit that we got checked out at the time. And they concluded this is like totally innocuous, you're fine. And we like really pushed to get it looked at, including by kind of explicitly saying like, can you please confirm this is not cancer, basically.
Yeah.
But it was on the same side of her body as the eye that was 5. And then the doctor could also feel kind of lymph nodes in her neck. And they were like, this could be, we found out afterwards from our oncologist that they kind of told them that like this could be the first child in the UK that's ever had eye cancer spread outside their body. And kind of as a result, we ended up with not just tests for like within her eye, but then tests for kind of cancer everywhere else. And so I think our record was something, I think at one point she had had something like 7 general anesthetics in like 10 days for all these different
because
tests.
they have to put her under in order to look at the eye, basically. Because
for your eyes, they have to do all of it like that.
18-month-old to just behave.
And then even for teenagers and stuff, all of it's general. But then they did things like they injected her with dye, which is some kind of dye that reacts which checks for spread. They did kind of more MRI scans.
CT
scan. So we just had that's kind of why we had so many tests. So at that point we're thinking like, okay, this could be extremely bad, because it's like the outlook's basically terrible if it's spread. So we went through all these kind of tests. It probably took about it took about 2 weeks to kind of confirm that in fact no, it has actually stayed inside our eye. Then very quickly we couldn't get the eye removed until the other tests had happened, got the eye removed, and then at that point like, okay, now we're doing chemotherapy for
her eye was replaced. There's an artificial eye.
So they do they remove your eye completely, and then they put like a plastic ball basically in where it was, and they sewed muscle over the top of it, and then they put like a disc. You have like this little, it looks like a contact lens, but just with like an eye on it, and it goes over the top, but it still moves around like a normal. It's not exactly perfect,
sort of follows the other eye effectively.
Like it'd be, if we were walking down the street, there's like no chance you would realise. But just sometimes if she's looking kind of all the way over to the side or something, it might not quite keep up. They kind of do that. You actually see people customise them and do all sorts of stuff.
Sorry, interrupt. So then onto the chemo.
Yes, then we're like, okay, right, now we're doing chemotherapy because we've got a tumour in her, like a late stage tumour in her remaining eye. They do something called Joe chemo. So it was
J-O.
They call it Joe chemo. It's a very kind of formulaic plan that they kind of do for retinoblastoma. So it was about 5 months of it or something. It's something like 6 treatments for like a couple of weeks each. It was more or less a 3-week kind of cycle.
And it was infusion, was it? So,
yeah. And then the other sort of things we'd also had to have done were getting a Hickman, like a double Hickman line put into her chest.
Yeah, sure.
Which is particularly stressful with a toddler.
That was so they could infuse without having to put a cannula in each time.
Because and she's just having like no end of, and then also like, and then they would do things like if she had to have like a transfusion or anything else during chemo, they'd also use this. And then the challenge with the toddler is, so they put in this line that goes into your jugular. Like you're worried about, like if they put it out, they can like literally bleed to death. Which had loads of other problems because it meant then our families were much more worried about looking after her. Because you literally get given like a kit with like some clips in it to like clip it shut if something happens that you have to take around with you. So she had this line put in. You can't get it wet is the other problem, because then especially during chemotherapy, it's like the main way that people get kind of more serious infections. So if you, like giving her baths or anything like that is just like all her baths were like this deep, and you're just trying to keep it dry, like you're trying to stop it getting wet the whole time. And this is kind of all the way through the winter as well, so it was just not it just made looking after her much harder work. We did kind of chemotherapy. They do these rounds where your immunity kind of just drops to we did get to like literally 0 at some points, and then kind of goes back up again. The first round was kind of a really weird experience. We kind of thought like, okay, like she's going to be like out for the count, like super ill, whatever. And it kind of just felt like she woke up and was unaffected by it for the next day or two. Then suddenly she started getting sick, but it took a bit longer than we thought to have kind of an effect.
They do say that with chemo cycles, the poison increases in the body, so it's the later cycles people feel much worse.
Yeah, it definitely seemed to. They didn't really tell us that was going to happen, but it 100% felt like she was getting kind of weaker as we were getting into like the 4th, 5th, 6th kind of rounds, and she was getting sicker each time. So the first round wasn't too bad, but we kind of went through all the chemotherapy. There are loads of other things that were quite challenging, like with managing it. And then out the other side, we got a bit lucky, frankly, with how she responded. So the tumor, if you're successful with chemotherapy with the retinoblastoma, the tumor basically just turns into sorry, my chemistry, it turns into it basically becomes like inert, more or less. All the cells dead.
But it's still there. So can we just talk about the technical aspect? So you've got the retina.
Yeah.
It's growing in the retina or on the retina.
Yeah, kind of immediately behind the retina.
So is it's affecting sight?
Yes, this was the other thing actually. We had a symptom. So over the course of kind of 5 days or so, she went from, you have no idea that her vision was impaired, but it would have actually been the case that she was blind in that eye, to kind of, so the eye that was kind of grade 5 would have had no vision at all. The other eye was obviously what she was therefore seeing with, but over the course of 5 days, it went from fine to like her starting to get quite strong, to noticeable that she was having strong with her eyesight.
Because the tumour was growing really rapidly, was it? Or
yeah, because it was quite big. I think because it was large at this stage, and it was in kind of multiple. Like there were several bits of it floating around. But what kind of happens is because the tumour grows behind your retina, it causes kind of bleeding inside your eye, which is what harms your vision because you just can't see through it. So suddenly we're finding she kind of was doing things like if we're walking around with her, she would just want to stop and sit down. Like she wouldn't see steps. She like at night time she's really unsure. But this all changed over the course of like a week because of things like bleeds happening quite quickly. It meant her retina detached. As well, with it kind of growing.
On the eye that was removed? Or
no, on the remaining one. And this is all happening in the same 2 weeks, basically. We're like, oh god, because then there are other really bad things. So, for example, chemotherapy can damage your hearing. So we're like, okay, if she loses her eyesight and she's also got bad hearing, it's a really awful combination. But yeah, her retina then reattached during chemo. The tumor will also it shrinks too. So her retina reattached, it's damaged, so it has like a fold in it apparently, which doesn't seem to hinder her at all at the moment. She seems to also be able to pick out letters and stuff, so again we'll find out when she's older how much it's actually affecting her. About
you've just dropped her off to school, so she's reading going on, is there?
Yeah, so she can pick out, so it seems to be fine, but again we've basically got very unlucky with what's happened to her, but extremely lucky with how she's sort of responded, where her retina's reattached like reasonably successfully. The tumour has shrunk a lot, which meant her vision has just come back to normal. So she actually can run around totally happily. Like nighttime, she'll go up and down steps, no problem. And she, now it's kind of the case that we're in monitoring mode. So the other thing we get asked all the time is kind of like, oh, are you, like, is it better yet? Or whatever. Like, well, like, it's kind of like, well, we get like, so it was every 4 to 6 weeks or something afterwards, we had to go and have another general anaesthetic to get her eye checked for the tumour growing back.
How were they checking that? They couldn't do it with an MRI? Or?
No, so they put her under, and I think they have specialist equipment for eyes that looks into them. It is very similar to an MRI scan, but I think it's a different machine they use or something, that's eye specific. There's one clinic in the UK that does it in London, and so also we're kind of glad not to live that far from London. But you then have to go and find out if it's reoccurred. It's something like an 88% likelihood that it comes back if you've got a tumour kind of dormant, basically. And then the probability hugely drops off. So over the course of like, I think by the time she gets to 5, it drops from 88% to like a couple of percentage points. So then suddenly it's like, okay, there's just like a fairly high, and then they kind of start extending the window out. So now we're more than a year out from treatment finishing, or recently a year out from the last round of chemotherapy finishing. And they're kind of like, okay, you can move this out to every like 4 or 5 months if you want to, and then they just gradually extend it out to every 6, then every year. And most kind of adult survivors of it have got kind of, they more or less forget they have it, and it's just like an extra random checkup they need to do. And that's because it comes from genes that make your eye grow in the first place, so that's why the probability just drops kind of off a cliff eventually. And again, there's very limited data though, because there's like...
Well, if you thought a year, there's a couple of thousand or something in the UK.
Yeah, so it's kind of all a bit...
Yeah.
And for a late stage, it's probably worse and stuff. So,
yeah,
you just have to kind of be quite mindful of it. It does, so now still worst case scenario is she loses her remaining eye, but it kind of feels like it'll be fine now. The treatments also differ greatly. So if you're having a check now, the treatment methods are quite different. So it won't be chemotherapy again. It's quite likely they'll do something like cryotherapy where they freeze it in situ. So in the same test, they'll apply a treatment. So probably statistically the most likely thing to happen next is that you'll get these much more minor treatments that just happen kind of on the day. But the worst case is like, oh, they can't, it's in a spot they can't reach, in which case you'll lose the other eye. But now we're just in this treatment cycle for kind of years, basically.
So that's the sort of practical side of it. Can we talk about the emotional side of it and how she's coping and what she's aware of, and you know what her friends around in school are aware of and so on? Yeah, so
I think there are a few things I think that surprised us about it. She's a very process-oriented child.
Follows her parents, maybe.
Yeah, she's like the opposite of us, completely. We're like anyway. So she kind of. She was too young to understand what was going on, basically, when she was smaller. Like now, she's probably at the age where she could just about understand what it is. But back then, just stuff was happening to her. I think that we tried to just get her to like work with the doctors and stuff a bit when she was doing things, so that she was a little bit in control of what was going on. So, for example, they have to change with the Hickman line. They have to change their dressing all the time. So we had people coming out to our house. Literally every day of the week at one point, to like peel off this thing, reattach it, but then we're just getting her kind of involved in like playing with all the medical equipment and stuff. So that seems to have gone fairly fine. There are other kids who you could kind of clearly see are like really struggling.
Mentally struggling.
Yeah, I think so. Like they would just not want anyone to touch them at all.
Yeah.
Because there's so much stuff you just have to, and then also it's during COVID, so there are we're constantly having to put like swabs in her throat and like up her nose and stuff, and like it also meant all the treatment was done, like more of it was done kind of in isolation. There were no toys in any of the hospitals, so yeah, for her that like there's only so much you really can do. I think for us the key thing we learned was I was pushing for, we moved house, like I think we moved into a new house like the week she got diagnosed, but which took the shine off it somewhat. I think that initially I was pushing for we should live in the middle of nowhere. Like our company works all remote. I was like looking at houses like in Scotland, being like, I get a lot more for my money up there. But my wife pushed not knowing what all this stuff was about to happen, like, no, we should stay like near family. And she was 100%, as usual, right on this topic. We're very lucky that we live within like an hour and a half of my wife's mum. My mum lives kind of half an hour away. But it would have been very hard without any help, because during chemotherapy, you have to isolate. It's very similar to as if COVID's happening, but kind of worse. So it sort of means that you can't have tons of people to like look after her or see her. You can't really go out and do stuff. So just having like a couple of family members that you can rely on heavily.
Like a bubble, a chemo bubble, possibly.
Yeah, like I think the key is to have like a small number of people that will like really help you is probably the best case scenario that you can end up in.
Plus, but you started with Addenbrooke's, which is our local hospital here, which I've been treated by, but you actually, most of it was in London, was it? You were moved to a specialist hospital in London.
It's really split across the two. So all the chemotherapy was done through Addenbrooke's and all the testing is in London. But the chemotherapy, I guess, is the bit where you have the most intense relationship probably with the hospital, because it's kind of like, I mean, we're in and out of hospital almost like probably every other day, I would say, on average. So being near the place, if you can be where the treatment is happening, was extremely useful. It also meant I think they were much more likely to let us go home. Whereas we can see other parents moving in with like luggage and stuff, which never, like the longest stay I think we had in hospital was about three nights or something like that. Again, it was during COVID, so like I couldn't be there as well, so it would just be my wife with her whilst I'm working. But being near the hospital was great. I think the other thing all the other things were useful. We ended up with like an oncologist on WhatsApp, which was extremely handy for like random questions. Like just having like someone there that you can kind of like, we made a lot of use of like the phone numbers and stuff they gave us. And like having family near was very important to us going through it. So for example, my wife stopped work for quite a long time. She's a teacher, which is probably a particularly bad job to have with someone with chemotherapy in your family because of just like germs and stuff.
Exactly,
I think eventually towards the end she went back to work, but it was during social distancing stuff anyway. But I wound up the thing that was difficult was then I was working from home. Really couldn't go to nursery anymore because you can't have. I think if you're a child rather than kind of a toddler, they encourage you to keep going to school. But if you're a toddler, like we just thought, like at nursery, even when she's not going through chemotherapy, she's still ill like half the time anyway. And our experience when she got ill was pretty bad. So for example, she picked up a cold. A friend came over to our house once, one of her friends, during a period of stronger immunity. And we did everything kind of outside, and she got a cold, but then worried about her, like her retina was really fragile, and then she's doing loads of sneezing and stuff, and we're really worried, and she invariably caught this cold, like invariably ended up having to go to hospital because everything will just escalate. We're worried about her really coughing and sneezing, and that potentially damaging her eye more. So the conclusion was basically my wife's mum and her stepdad would come up for a couple of days a week, whilst I was working from home, whilst my wife would work, and then the other couple of days a week it was just my wife at home looking after her. But even that was quite difficult because looking after her was just much harder than normal, because you've got this kind of pressure of not wanting to go. We struggled with kind of getting our family comfortable with taking her by themselves, like one of us kind of being there. So it kind of wound up
the Hickman, etc., etc.
Yeah, so they weren't comfortable with it, which I think I would have pushed harder for right at the start. Next time would be like, this just is how it is. Like it's a risk that we're taking too. Like it's just a clamp. So
there's a huge difference between you being the cause of a child's death and the parent. The responsibility different.
So that was probably one of the worst parts of it because it kind of meant that we were still there constantly. So I was literally doing work meetings. And then the other thing that was happening was during chemo she completely stopped eating. She would eat literally nothing. We found that. We had to get anything into it, we had to use a feeding tube. So she had that fitted within about a week of starting the first round of chemotherapy. So then you've got more tubes attached to her. And that was a complete nightmare basically. So we found that so with a feeding tube you have to hold you have all this feed that you're trying to give them. The game you're basically playing is it's attached to her. The tube, if you have the tube really long, it's much more likely she'll pull it out, and then you have to refit it, which is a horrible experience for her. If you have the tube kind of shorter, then she's kind of running around being a toddler whilst you're trying to feed her. Excuse me. And there's no lid on this thing because then the liquid won't go through because it'll form a vacuum. So you've got this liquid and it doesn't go in fast because it's literally going straight into her stomach. So it takes kind of 20 minutes maybe for a feed to go through. So it's a long time, and you have to do this multiple times a day, like theoretically maybe 3 or 4 times a day. So I'm coming out of meetings to try and and then also our family weren't that comfortable with doing a feeding tube either. Because there are multiple things you can do wrong with it. So I was kind of coming out of a Zoom call or something, trying to get a feed into her, then going back onto another Zoom call afterwards. It just kind of meant and then the other thing that also happened was when she was, especially towards the latter half of the treatment, if we gave her too much through the feeding tube, she'd just be sick. So then you end up reducing the size of the feeds, which means they're much more frequent. So you're towards the end, I was probably doing 8 or 10 of them a day, and you're also including things like, oh, should we do one while she's asleep in the middle of the night? So you're we'd be up at 1 in the morning just holding a feeding tube in bed, trying to get something into her, and then if you get it wrong, she would throw up all over the bed, and then you've got to replace the whole bed and stuff.
We just go back to how you think she feels. Now, it's your first and only child, so you've got much to compare it with, but she's happy. I mean, she's... Yeah,
it was kind of odd because she's... we just tried to give... Basically, I think the thing we tried to do, which I think worked really well, was trying to give her as much control as we could over what was happening to her, which just meant small things. Like if the doctors were doing her observations where they would put something on your finger to do your heart rate and stuff, we'd get her involved in attaching it, or if she's having her dressings changed and stuff, we get her to hold a t-shirt up or whatever. So we tried to kind of give her a little bit of a semblance of control over it all, which I think made a big difference to her. What else happened? Yeah, I think we were really, I was very, very impressed with what it was like interacting with I kind of get the impression that they just kind of have the A team work on children's cancer in hospitals is how I felt. They were just all really friendly, so she kind of knew the names of all the people we're dealing with and stuff.
Both hospitals were similar.
Yeah, and people come into our house as well. So you start to she kind of gets to know people a little bit. So they were really very excellent. But I think we're just trying to give her as much control as we could. I think from our perspective, we struggled with just I wish we'd put more work in kind of before it just became the case that we were kind of doing everything with giving treatments and food to her. We just needed a little bit more help with that. Would have made a big difference to us, I think. And then I think the other thing we found with her, I think that was basic. And we also tried to keep some semblance of normality around things like food, so she wouldn't eat anything because she just obviously felt terrible all the time. But we would still have dinner with her and stuff. There would notionally be food there for her, but we just kept up the kind of rituals around that stuff. So then afterwards, it took quite a long time to get her back to normal with eating. Probably another 4 to 6 months maybe until it felt smooth again. So it took that, and so I'm kind of glad we at least tried to keep it the case that food exists in her life, which would have been quite easy to just not bother with.
I'm really astonishing. I mean, for new parents, completely new situation.
Yeah, we also didn't know what we're doing.
Only 40 in the country, so that even the system doesn't really know necessarily how to help you in different ways as compared with other types of cancer. I'm really astonished. I respect you so much for where you've got to and your ability to put it across in a. I know you're not that an emotional person in a business situation.
I'm not outside.
People who've been listening and watching this must be just horrified by what you've been through.
Yeah, it would.
Now we ought to finish here because we almost got to the half-hour point actually. Which so just point out, I'm going to put something in the show notes about James' entrepreneurial story. Many of us, people from past know, I've done the Investor, which is helping entrepreneurs and angel investors. And I'd love to do the same thing for another half hour with James, but I won't. But I'll put it in the show notes if anybody's interested in that side of his life, which was building a business, now employing 50 or more people during the time when the daughter was so ill. So you've done phenomenally well.
No, thanks. No, it's been okay. The company side was taking off, and that was a big, if anything, it was a good kind of break from I'm probably fortunate that the company side was going so well at the same time. So it would have been worse, I think, if it was tanking or whatever. But yeah, I'm also just message or comment or whatever. Like, I would love to help people if you get stuck or you're in a similar situation.
We'll put some contact ability to get to James from that. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode or watching or listening to this episode. Learned from James's journey, James and Fran and Ruby's journey. And thank you very much for listening.
Cool. Thank you.